So today we're looking into our last chapter of the market structures. So to this point, we talked about the competitive market, which is a market that has many firms, but that are all selling identical products, and many sellers that are all rational and all that good stuff. Before spring break, we talked about monopolies. This is where we have one firm that produces the entire market supply of goods. Uh, and today we're looking at kind of some middle cases. So to this point, we have one extreme where we have a ton of firms. Then we have an extreme where there's only one firm today. And this is oftentimes I have this labeled imperfect competition. We're talking about these two last structures, monopolistic competitions and oligopoly. Today we'll probably get mostly through monopolistic, and then on Wednesday and Friday move into the oligopoly section. And the oligopoly is the part that I personally think is one of the most fun parts of micro. Uh, it's the part where, in the beginning of class, I mentioned that we learn to stab each other in the back. This is where it happens. Oops. Am I still on? Yeah, I'm still on. Cool. Sorry about that. One note crashed. Cool. Whatever. So today, these are the two things we're going to be looking at, and really what we'll be getting into. And if you and also the guided notes, they're on Blackboard for you. So if you want to print them out, you can. If you don't want to, you certainly don't have to, but that is your discretion. So when we think about these middle ground type of market structures, we're largely looking at we have a few things going on. The first thing, I mentioned this imperfectly competitive market. This again, we're not a monopoly, but we're also not perfect competition. We're somewhere in the middle, somewhere where things maybe get a little more interesting. And the two types of markets that we're going to look at in this chapter is first monopolistic competition. And this is where we have a lot of firms that are selling similar but not necessarily identical products. So basically the idea here is that we can tell where our goods came from. So if you think about fast food, you can tell the difference between a Culver's burger and a McDonald's burger, or a Culver's chicken sandwich, McDonald's chicken sandwich, or whatever your favorite fast food item is. So basically, we can tell where our goods come from, and they're distinguishable between two different firms. The other type of market we'll look at is the oligopoly. And this is where we have a relatively small amount of firms that basically control the entire industry. So with this, we'll often think about for the oligopoly will be our airlines and our cell phone providers. And so that's two I'm going to pick on. So when we think about airlines, and even if we thought about all the airlines that are out there, not just our legacy carriers, right, they're there. But if I think about, I want to go from Des Moines, Iowa to anywhere in the world, odds are I'm going to be starting with either American, Delta, or United. So we have those three carriers. They control a very large share of the market, and that's what our oligopoly is going to look at, and so on. And same thing with the cell phone provider. For the most part, America has four networks: Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, and five networks: Sprint, AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and US Cellular. If you live in, I don't know about necessarily living in Boone, but if you live outside of Boone, you pretty much have to have either Verizon or US Cellular. But even across the country, most people have one of those five providers. And even if you have something like Boost Mobile or Virgin Mobile, you're going to feed off of one of those networks. So again, those few networks basically control the entire market for cell phone service. So the big thing we're looking at with our monopolistic competition is this first thing, which is differentiated products. And again, when we mention a differentiated product, we're just saying that we as consumers, this can be actually one of two things. Either the product is different or it's perceived to be different or distinct in some way to a consumer. So we have kind of four things that we're going to pick on to figure out, what does it mean to be differentiated or how can we differentiate products. This first one looks at physical aspects, and this pretty much means that our product is actually different. Like it's physical, it's not the same thing. So if we think about like if we think about like French fries, and suppose we think about McDonald's versus Five Guys. Five Guys, if you're not familiar, it's a burger joint, but they are known for cooking their French fries in peanut oil, whereas McDonald's cooks them in regular vegetable, canola, whatever oil they use. Um, but when we think about these, there is a physical difference between their product, and they may even be shaped different. So whereas McDonald's has the shoestring fries, I think um, not 100% sure on this, but I think Five Guys has maybe a thicker fry. I'm not 100% sure on that, but right, they just have these different products. They're made different, and physically they are different. Think about a Big Mac versus a Whopper. They're both burgers, but one has two patties, one has one patty, and so on. So our products are able to be physically different. The second thing we can differentiate is our location. And there are times you may have heard location is everything. It certainly matters to some degree. So when we think about location, this could be either how far or how convenient is it to get somewhere, to go to one place over another. So if I think about something like, suppose I think about something like McDonald's or Dairy Queen or Subway, right? Some sort of chain that's in Boone. What this location looks at is why would I go to the Boone Subway and not the Ames Subway? Or why would I go to if I'm gonna go get Subway for lunch today, why would I go to Boone and not Las Vegas, the Subway, right? Because they're selling the exact same product and so on. So for me as a consumer, the location obviously makes a difference. I'm going to go to the Boone Subway because it's a lot more convenient. It's a 10-minute drive instead of a 20-hour drive, right? So our location certainly matters. And maybe even if you're thinking about like a gas station, if you're going if you're driving down a road and there are two gas stations, you're probably more likely, if they were the same, if you had two Casey's right across the street from each other, two of the same gas station right across the street from each other, more than likely, if you're driving one way, you're probably going to go to the one on the right side of the road because it's more convenient for you to turn right than turn left because we drive on the right side in America. So location from which we sell certainly matters as well. These last two start to get a little more washy, I guess. But the third one, intangible aspects. These are things where they're intangible, so you can't just tell necessarily by looking at the business or looking at their product or something that has nothing to do with the product. So, a couple of these that we may look at is values of the firm. So there are people who will either support or not support a firm for maybe uh, things they support or beliefs that their leadership tends to share. So I have that values that the firm may have, but we also may look at things like big versus small business. So right now, one of the things that's going around is, and not going around like isn't a flu, but one of the things I'm seeing a lot is people are saying, "Oh, we need to make sure." And I'm not saying you should or shouldn't, but people are saying, "Oh, you need to support your local businesses, right?" Because, excuse me, because right now they're like the most impacted. So you need to support your local businesses, and right, we're hearing that. What people may do is they may say, well, I have a choice to go to either Boone Hardware or Home Depot. They may choose to go to Boone Hardware because it's owned by somebody local. It's owned by somebody in town, and some people value that, others not as much. But that's something that, right, it's intangible. If I look at a hammer or I look at whatever it is I bought at the store, I don't really have any way of telling if it was sold by a local shop or a big chain shop. And the other side of this intangible aspects that could be a little harder to tell is even within your stores, it can often be hard to tell if it is a smaller, large business. And the reason I say that is if we think about like McDonald's or Subway. So a lot of your McDonald's aren't actually owned by McDonald's. They're owned um, by a local person who owns it, operates it, and they basically pay a loyalty fee to or a franchising fee to McDonald's. So even though it has the branding and the big business uh, support, I guess you might say, it's still owned by somebody local. And if you look at, I know a lot of the McDonald's in Central Iowa are owned by the O'Brien family, but if you look at the windows, sometimes it'll say what family owns it or who owns it or whatever the case is. So you have those intangible aspects. Again, those might lead me to support or not support a certain firm, as well as if I know the person who operates a shop, I may be more willing to shop with them and maybe even spend more money at their shop than I would at Walmart or Home Depot. And the last one is perceptions. So perceptions, it's kind of two fronts that I'm going to look at this from. The first is uh, these perceptions will come as feelings towards a firm, and the second will be expectations. So when I think about McDonald's, right, um, one of the things that I think about when I think of them is I really expect consistency. I know that if I go to McDonald's, I'm not going to have a meal that I'm going to write to my family about and say, "Oh, I went to McDonald's and it was the best experience I've ever had." Right? I know I'm not going to get that. I know that, and if anybody happens to work at McDonald's or anywhere I pick on, uh, I'm just using them because it's why. Well, it's because it's, I don't know. You know what I mean? But just because, but if I don't expect to go to McDonald's and say, "Oh, this is the best meal I've ever had," right? I expect to go there and I expect to know what I'm going to get, right? I expect to say, "Hey, I know it's not going to be like super the best thing I've ever had, but it also I really don't expect it to be the worst meal I've ever had either, right? I expect it to be all right. It's gonna take care of what I need it to take care of right now. So our feelings towards a firm, something like McDonald's, maybe that's what I expect. If you went to a certain brand of a hotel and you had a bad experience, whether the bed wasn't soft or you came across bugs or maybe it wasn't clean, you might be afraid to stay at that hotel, or excuse me, you might be afraid to stay at that same brand, even if it's somewhere 1,000 miles across the country owned by a completely different person, just because you have that perception of this is what I'm going to get with X brand of hotel. The second thing is expectations. So one of the things we don't have a lot of in Iowa are seafood buffets. And in general, seafood, it's not really an Iowa specialty. Because there's no such thing as fresh Iowa crab or Iowa lobster or anything silly like that. So when I think about my expectations, I might think of something like seafood in Iowa or something like beef in Florida. So when I have our so if I go out and I get a crab or a lobster, whatever the case is, I know it wasn't grown or I know it wasn't caught like this morning, right? It had to have been shipped in. It had to have been brought in from either the East Coast, the West Coast, or Alaska, or somewhere. It had to be brought in. So if I came across, if I was at the store and for whatever reason they were selling Iowa lobster, I might be a little hesitant to buy it. Same thing with um, well, any type of seafood in Iowa, really, unless it's like catfish or some kind of lake fish. But on the other side, Florida is, and in the South, if you're along the coast, the beef isn't really that good. And we went to when we lived in Myrtle Beach, we went to one of the nicer places around there, and eh, I got a steak, and it wasn't quite like it is here in the Midwest. So if you think about something like that, whereas here, right, we say, well, right, the cattle come from, maybe 10 miles away from Boone or 10 miles away from wherever you are. Whereas for Florida, again, just like we don't have a really good supply of seafood, Florida doesn't really have, and I mean, and I'm sure, and I know they have cows in Florida, but they don't have quite the same cow that we have here in Iowa. So something like that. If I'm in Iowa, I may expect a good seafood. Excuse me. If I'm in Iowa, I may actually expect a good steak or good pork, whatever the case is. If I'm in Florida, I expect good seafood. Uh, if I'm in Iowa, I expect good corn. If I'm in Florida, I expect good oranges. Right. So we just have these expectations that can come in our perceptions of different fruits or whatever the case may be. So we have our differentiated products, and what we're interested in is how does a monopolistic competitor actually behave? So what we're going to see happen is they're going to very closely act the same way as a monopolist. That is, they'll set a marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. Then they'll find the price, and that is on the demand curve, and then they'll work it out so that they have basically the same exact thing that a monopolist did. However, what we're going to see with them, and they also will face this downward sloping demand curve, and so on. But what we're going to see is different is the big difference, I guess, is the monopolistic competitor is going to have has a more elastic demand curve. So with this, what I may think of is something like jeans and Levi jeans. So Levi is a specific brand, and there is a difference potentially between different brands of jeans. There's a difference between Levi's and Wranglers and uh, whatever one of the nice brand, whatever one of the really nice brands are. Right? There's differences between them. They're not all exactly the same, but they serve the same basic function. They're jeans. They do what they need to do. So Levi's will be more elastic than jeans as a whole. Because if Levi's becomes either inconvenient or they support something that I don't agree with, or they and I don't know if Levi's takes any political stances, so I don't really know about that. But if Levi's has that, or if they raise their prices too much, whatever the case is, I can switch to another brand of jeans. So what we'll see happen with their curve is suppose we looked at two firms. The first is a monopolist, we talked about last week. The second is a competitive monopolist or competitive monopolist. And what we'll tend to see happen is something like this. So we have on the y-axis, we have dollars. And on the x, we'll have our quantity. So whereas the monopolist has this full demand curve. So if we had USA brand jeans and it was the only brand you could buy, right, they're gonna control the entire market and they're gonna see the market demand curve. However, what the competitive monopolist will do is they'll be one of a few firms and they're gonna take just a share of that market, but a decent share. So, excuse me, they might be able to do something like this. Okay. So they're going to be, oops, let me get that looking a little better. They're going to look something like that. So the basic idea is uh, they're going to be flatter. Less people are buying from a competitive monopolist than monopolist because they don't, they have choices, but also the competitive monopolist has to charge a lower price because, again, I have choices. So what we're looking at is, again, this, since it is flatter, it is going to be more elastic. Whereas, again, our green curve is less elastic. That's the key distinction between the monopolistic competitor and the monopolist, or the competitive monopoly, whatever the order of it is. The monopolistic competitor and the monopolist, right? They act the exact same way because nobody else has Levi's jeans, but I can switch to another brand even if I don't like it as much. If the price is right or whatever's going on is going on, I can deal with it. So that's the key thing that I'm going to bring up with the monopolistic competition. It kind of is what it is. Uh, monopolists pretty much act the same way, and so on. Again, their revenue, their profit, their costs, same way as the monopolists, just they'll have less profit, and so on. So what that gets us into is what I think is the more fun part of this chapter, and that's the oligopoly. Or I think it's one of the most fun parts of the course, but oh well. So what we see in the oligopoly is that we have a small number of firms, and we introduced this in the beginning of today. We have the small number of large firms that are going to pretty much control an industry. And we're going to see with the oligopolists is they are going to have kind of two choices. And they're going to have to think a little more than what we've had. Excuse me. The oligopolist is going to have to think a little bit more because since there are just a few firms, what the other firm does matters to what I decide to purchase. Or, excuse me, what the other firm does decides what's best for me. And throughout the next couple days, we'll see some examples and all that fun stuff. But when we look at the oligopolists, we see they have a choice to either compete or collude. And if they choose to compete, they're going to act a lot. They're going to act, again, the word here, keyword similarly, they're going to act similar to a competitor. That is, they're going to have low costs, low prices, and they're not necessarily going to have zero profits, but it's going to lead to zero profits. So if I'm an oligopolist and I compete, I'm going to charge a lower price than monopolist would, but a higher price than a competitive market. My other choice is to collude. And if we collude, we are going to very much act like a monopoly. So we are going to push prices up, earn consistent high levels of profit, and so on. So when we think about our oligopolies, again, and we're going to come back to the blanks if you're doing the notes. When we think about our oligopolies, again, we often think about things like airlines, cell phone providers. We could even say car manufacturers, right? Whatever makes us happy, we can say. Well, whatever makes us happy that is an oligopoly. But that's a few examples that we may see. So when we get into collusion, and this is a fun part, and it has actually a pretty relevant implication to what's going on right now with gas prices. Well, there's always collusion with gas prices, but you'll see when we get there. So when we have collusion, this is when two firms are acting together, and what they're going to do is they're going to reduce output to keep prices high. So they're going to work together to act like monopolists and not act like they're competing against each other. So to do this, they kind of have three steps. The first is they keep track of quantity, or they hold down quantity. So what this looks like is our quantity stays low, quantity supply stays low, I should say. But when you have a low quantity, you have a higher price. So this will lead to our price being higher. And then what they may do is divide the profit among themselves. They don't necessarily have to, but it could be something that they decide to do. So if we think about, okay, suppose we have a highway, right? And we'll make it a 2-lane highway. So yeah, so we have a 2-lane highway. And right here you have a sign and it says last gas for 300 miles. And we have two gas stations. Over here we have a Come and Go. And over here we have a Casey's. So we have these two gas stations, and going this way, it's the last exit for last gas for 300 miles. So you're coming in your car, right? And you see it's the last gas for a while, so you need to stop and get gas. Now, if they decide to collude, right, they're going to both charge a high price. So they might charge like, say, $5.50 a gallon for gas because they can. Right? There's no one to compete with. So they agree, hey, we're going to charge this high price. Now, if I'm going this way, so if I'm going away from, so if I'm going towards this sign that says last gas for 300 miles, more than likely, I'm going to make the turn into Casey's because it's more convenient to turn right than turn left. Because if I turn left, I have to cross traffic. I have to maybe deal with the red light. Whereas if I turn right, I can turn in, turn out, and I'm good to go. So what they might say is Casey's will end up selling more because more people are going to go that way. So instead of saying, so in order to get Come and Go to not lower their price and get people to want to take that left, Casey's will say, hey, we'll split our profits. To some degree, we'll split what we make. That way, you don't have an incentive to do anything. Can I go back up a slide? Sure. Is that what you need? And I can give you just a second for it. Oh, the collusion one, this one. So on the first part, we have these lower quantity, high price, then we divide the profit among ourselves. But now if we choose to act in collusion, or we choose to take this action, we're going to enter what's called a cartel. And this is basically just some group that has an agreement to collude. And we say, hey, we're going to produce monopoly output, monopoly price, and we're going to be better off for it. So when we think about cartels, right, a big example we often hear about are potentially drug cartels, right? That's how drugs get from, like, Central America, South America, or Europe, or it's kind of the streamline to get drugs into the States. But something that I'm going to get a little more into, which is actually, like, again, it's really relevant for this week, is OPEC. And OPEC, I'm just going to make sure I get the abbreviation right, is the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And what OPEC is a bunch of countries, and specifically, it's countries like, well, let me pull up this map. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Venezuela, looks like Algeria and Libya, and then a few other countries in Africa. So a bunch of countries, and basically they control like 83% of the world's oil, something like that. And they kind of work to see, what does it say? 81.5 of the world's proven oil reserves. So what they do is they kind of work to keep oil prices relatively stable and if not relatively high. Um, the hard part for them is, again, you do have other countries that produce oil, Canada, the US, and so on. So, right, they have these little obstacles in the way, but they try to keep oil prices high or sustainable, and they really look out for the oil price. However, right now, one of the things we notice right now today is that gas prices are super low right now. Yesterday we went out and got gas for, I think, $1.59, maybe $1.69. So we can look and say today's low gas prices. And we can attribute this to a couple places. One is a steep fall in demand. And this is from our whole corona thing, or coronavirus activity. Okay. So that's right. Even if we do decide that we're going to go somewhere, there's nothing to do there because everything's closed. So if everything's closed, we may as well stay at home. Um, we almost went out to Branson, but our park closed down there, so we ended up actually went up to Mount Rushmore, which was really cool. But so we have that low demand, right? People are driving less, and even this week, today, I didn't drive to work. After this class, I'm not taking off going to Ames. Instead, I'm just gonna stay home and stay home. So we're not driving as much. We're not going out to movie theaters. We're not doing all that stuff. So there is less demand, which brings the price down. But the second thing that's really impacting this, and this is like going on, I think it's still going on right now. Excuse me. What's going on right now actually is a price war in gas between Saudi Arabia and Russia. So basically what they're doing is they're saying, so if we come over here, right, I can scroll back in a second. In our initial state, the two gas stations said, hey, we're going to cooperate, we're going to be nice. But then suppose they break that, then they come in and they have a, right, they decide to compete against each other. So suppose that brings gas down to say $2.49 a gallon. Right? Which legally in the US you have to compete, you can't collude because it's unfair to the consumer. But right now, whereas a lot of attention is going to coronavirus, another thing going on, and from what I've seen, the Wikipedia article on this seems fairly straightforward, and it's a nice little reference for it. But there's an oil price war right now. So what we're going to do is our two gas stations. So we've cooperated, but now what we're going to do is they're going to say, well, we don't like you. We're not happy with what you're doing. So instead of $2.49, which would have been our competitive price, maybe I might lower my price down to $2.09. So I can potentially, well, if we think about what a war means, right? If you go to war, you're out to destroy, whether it be a physical war, a cyber war, an economic war in the sense of tariffs and stuff. You're meant to disrupt or destroy their economy. So in this case, Come and Go might say, hey, we're going to drop gas down to $2.09, knowing that that's not the best for them, but knowing more that Casey's can't afford that, which would disrupt Casey's. And Casey's might say, well, if you're going to do that, we're just going to let you have it and go to $1.99. And this can go kind of back and forth a little bit until we kind of have what we have today with $1.59 oil. So there's this oil war going on, and has certainly and while a big part of what we're seeing going on right now with the stock market going down and all that, the stock market crashing, it crashed. With the stock market crash and everything going on, a big part of it is this increase in demand because we're all staying home. But even though we are staying home, uh, if you've just and not that you go out and cough on people, but if you've been out at all, places are like your restaurants are doing carry out. They're still busy, so it's not like people aren't eating out. People are still buying stuff. Right? People are crazy with toilet paper, so that's always fun. But the other thing going on that really is escalating what's going on right now is going to be this price war, which drops the oil market. When oil goes down, it kind of has a trickle throughout the rest of the economy. So these two put together leads to are really what's contributing to what's going on economically today. But again, OPEC, their goal is to keep oil prices relatively high. However, when they initiate this price war, um, obviously that becomes a little bit harder when you're doing that and there's nobody's driving anywhere. So you have that going on with cartels. In the US, these are illegal because they are uncompetitive. So they're illegal because they are uncompetitive and they're not good for the consumer. But if and drug cartels are outright bringing illegal substances into the country, or they're dealing with illegal substances, whether coming from in or domestic, whatever the case may be. Oh. But if we think about something like OPEC, it becomes a little bit harder for them because they are it's a collection of they're considered an intergovernmental organization. So they're a collection of different governments. And the problem with governments is they're sovereign, so you can't really, unless you want to go to war, you can't really tell another government, hey, don't join a cartel, because they're free to do that, and it's just hard uh, to do that. So collusion in general, it's gonna be illegal everywhere. Or excuse me, collusion is illegal in most places. There may be some places where they don't enforce it as much. So if you think about somewhere, so if you go on like a vacation to, I don't know, a country that's a little poorer than the U.S., so something like Bahamas or Jamaica, if local vendors like collude to charge tourists a higher price, odds are they're not going to really go. The Jamaican government, the Bahamian government, isn't really going to go after them too much because they kind of have a different system than we do. Um, and as you get into, how do I put this? As you get more and more out of the first world, it becomes harder to enforce. So whereas in the U.S., if there's collusion going on, I can outright look at it. I can see it. I know who I can call. I can call a Federal Trade Commission or the county or the state or whoever I need to call, and they'll get on it because they'd be looking out for their own citizens. But if you go to somewhere like a foreign country, especially if it's potentially poor, um, whereas it may technically be illegal to collude, they might say, they're tourists. It doesn't matter if they pay extra or not. So technically, I think it's illegal everywhere. Give me a second. I'll just check that really quick. Where is collusion legal? Um, So it's pretty much in most of the first world, it's illegal. There's not really too much. I'm not really getting too much quickly about other countries, but um, it's there, and there are ways to get around it. So there are exceptions. Um, that is, you can have things like what do I want to say? And in general, when we get to antitrust laws, we'll see some of this. But one of the things I heard about recently was Major League Baseball. So Major League Baseball has, and in general, a lot of your sports, they have things like price caps, and uh, they may have market caps where you can't. So I can't just go start a Major League Baseball team in Des Moines, right? That they wouldn't let the Major League Baseball wouldn't let me do it, but the teams would say, "Hey, no, you can't do it because it's right between Minneapolis and Kansas City, and we're a small market." But when we think about something like a price cap, and what this is it's going to say you can only pay your players so much. Uh, Basically, what happened was and in the 80s, this happened. Major League Baseball, all the owners said, "Hey, we're gonna only pay our workers so much," but then they got in trouble for antitrust law because uh, it's collusion. Although it may be on the other side of the deal, it's collusion because you have to um, pay, or you have to compete, and we don't like collusion. So pretty much, I don't believe it's legal in Mexico. Um, but for sure, US, Canada, most of the European Union, it is illegal, but I'm sure there are places where uh, it is legal. It's a country by country basis. I don't necessarily have every country's information off the top of my head. So we have that, and that's collusion. So getting into our last little bit for today, just kind of an introduction to what we're going to look at on Wednesday, and we'll see how we're doing on Friday. Actually, Friday we probably won't have a live session because I have a meeting with. I have an online meeting with one of our faculty committees. So Friday we won't have a live session, but Wednesday we will. We will have more live sessions than I thought we would, just because I didn't anticipate, like, when I was talking at the end of class, I wasn't anticipating everything closing like it is. So I would anticipate more live sessions, and I seem to make it think like it would be. But still, with that, if you have something going on, go do whatever you have going on. So we're looking at our last little bit for today, and just an introduction to what we have tomorrow is Wednesday is game theory. Now, what this is going to do is we're going to look at situations where players or agents, firms, consumers, whatever it is, make decisions, but their payoff is dependent on what the other person decides to do. So if I think about something like tic tac toe or chess or any type of game, I have to alter my decisions based off of what you do. And if you think about chess, someone who's really good at chess is like 20 moves ahead of anybody else. Um, it's the ultimate game of, again, you make a move, I have to alter based off of that. So game theory, again, it's really what we're start looking at on Wednesday, um, and look at how we make decisions when our decision is dependent on what someone else does. And we'll dive into that, and then after we get through with our game theory and get through the theory side of it, I have a couple examples that come through. One is a what's called prisoner's dilemma. This is where you outright you have a prisoner and you decide whether or not to snitch on your friend or not. The other deals with like price with cartels and colluding on prices. And then the last two that we'll get into, one will be about political campaigns. So we look at, why do political campaigns always turn ugly? And then we'll finish up this chapter talking about a couple other examples. One of them being nuclear weapons, and another being like a movie, like a movie game type thing where you have to decide what movie you want to go to. So that's pretty much what I have for today.